Dr. Mullenix received her PhD, her BS degree from Truman State University. Her PhD was in pharmacology from the University of Kansas Medical Center, and her postdoctoral training in environmental medicine from the Johns Hopkins School of Hygiene and Public Health. For 20 years while at the Harvard School of Medicine, Boston's Children's Hospital, and Forsyth's Dental Infirmary for Children, her research focused on the development of screening procedures for neurobehavioral disruption caused by perinatal exposure to drugs and environmental pollutants such as lead, radiation, and fluoride. She's also served at the head of Department of Toxicology at Forsyth. She led the investigation into the neurotoxicity of fluoride using the sensitive computer pattern recognition system. She has maintained private consulting practice for over 30 years, dealing with a variety of toxic exposures and related litigation. Please welcome Phyllis Mullenix.
As I said, it's a pleasure being here. This is my third time speaking with you on my favorite subject of fluoride. I have had an opportunity with my misfortunes, I guess if you would call it that, with publishing a paper saying that fluoride is neurotoxic. A lot has happened since those days, and I actually am quite pleased with the direction that I'm taking. I no longer work with animals. I'm interested only in effects in humans, and I am trying to help individuals that have suffered chronic fluoride poisoning. So I'm here today to talk about the problems of diagnosing and treating chronic fluoride poisoning. One of the first things that you have, years ago, 1975, the Handbook of Legal Medicine admitted that sodium fluoride in the form of rat poison or roach powder is in such widespread use that it is surprising that there are not more reported instances of poisoning by this substance. The fact that fluoride is probably more likely to be missed in a routine toxicological analysis than any other inorganic substance may account for the apparent rarity of this type of poisoning. The situation is, he was talking about acute fluoride poisoning, not chronic. And in acute, which is a lot easier to recognize than chronic fluoride poisoning, they weren't even looking for that. So if you're not looking for problems with acute fluoride poisoning, how on earth can you go in to diagnose chronic fluoride poisoning? I have to remember to point. The diagnosis of chronic fluoride poisoning in the U.S., I call it the 3D diagnosis. First of all, the first D is dismiss dental fluorosis as a cosmetic effect. So most of the dental communities, public health, they consider dental fluorosis a cosmetic effect, so there's really no need to worry about treatment or if it's a cosmetic effect, so you can make the teeth pretty and ignore it. The next D is deny. Deny the existence of soft tissue effects, meaning deny the existence that it affects the brain or the thyroid or the kidney or any other tissue besides mineralized tissue. And then distort, the final D of diagnosis, the way it's been done in the past. They've distorted the bone effects as osteosclerosis only. And osteosclerosis is the favorite benchmark that industry tries to use as being the only outcome that is important in chronic fluoride poisoning. And they use a simple test like X-rays, as you see here, and where the hyperdense of the bones will show or indicate osteosclerosis. The problem is, chronic fluoride poisoning, even effects on the bones, is not just osteosclerosis. It's a metabolic bone disease. It affects soft tissues. It affects a lot of things. And so they focus you on osteosclerosis, which is very difficult to get and happens relatively rarely. And that's why they've used it as an excuse to say that chronic fluoride poisoning doesn't happen in the United States. So metabolic bone diseases with osteoporosis, stress fractures, skeletal deformities, osteomalacia, arthritis, they don't consider a part of chronic fluoride poisoning. I'd like to go back in the timeline, and as you probably remember, I've gone back in that timeline because of my experience with Harold Hodge and him being in my department. So I've been interested, and I've gone back and gone back and gone back to try and look at the development over the time. And I want to start here. You all know about the ADA, but I wanted to bring you forward with the AMA and what they've been doing over the years, and compare it in the timeline with what Harold Hodge knew and when did he know it. Starting in 1943, the AMA said the fluorides are general protoplasmic poisons. They basically that didn't come out the color. The enzymes that they said were affected, they had a whole list of them that inhibited the esterases, phosphatases. There's a whole list of enzymes that they knew that fluoride would inhibit, or RNA repair, RNA synthesis, adenylate cyclase. And there were also other enzymes that it would stimulate. But going on, in 1944 came the peach crop litigation, and I'm sure you've heard of that if you've read Christopher Bryson's book. But it was a litigation that basically turned the heel around with respect to how they deal with fluoride and fluoridation. At that time, and the Journal of the American Dental Association was saying in 44 that 1.2 to 3 parts per million fluoride in drinking water caused osteosclerosis, spondylosis, osteopetrosis, goiter, and that the risk was too great to fluoridate water, just to prevent dental disfigurements among children. 1944 to 1950, though, both the ADA and the U.S. Public Health Service turned around and they endorsed water fluoridation. So in less than a period of a year there, they went from completely saying the fluoride was a protoplasmic poison and that it caused all these other effects, that it was too great you couldn't fluoridate the water. Now Hodge at this time, in the 1946 to be specific, in declassified documents, he knew a little secret from working with humans in factories that were being exposed to fluoride. He knew that fluoride effects were enhanced by metals, but they didn't publicize that information. So just tuck that little timeline there, back in 1946 that Hodge knew this. 1945, of course, started the 10 to 15-year fluoridation experiment in Newburgh, Grand Rapids, and Ontario. To carry it forward then, in 1955, I'm going to go forward up to 2000, where the American Medical Association and how they came along during this time. In 1955, the AMA's policy was that they had no comment on the safety of fluoridation. They relied on the ADA and the U.S. Public Health Service. So basically, they were hands-off. They were letting the dental community to take the lead on fluoridation. In 1958, they said no guarantee of safety for fluoridation and that they were doing no investigation as to the side effects or any complaints of there being a problem. In 1965, the American Medical Association actually turned around a bit and endorsed the principle of fluoridation, but they still wouldn't come across with any safety claims, and that they wouldn't talk about any investigation of any of the side effects. So the AMA was still silent and lurking in the background. Meanwhile, Hodge was very busy at coming out with his publications, and he was very busy trying to disassociate acute toxicity mechanisms meaning inhibition of glycolytic enzymes, shock, mild renal pathology, calcium binding, and acute and chronic mechanisms. He was trying to convince everybody that acute fluoride toxicity is a very different animal than chronic fluoride toxicity. And the reason that he had to disassociate that is because at that time, remember, we had a lot of nerve gases that were being used. And fluoride, of course, is used in making of nerve gases, and they are anticholinesterase agents. And they have very distinct signs and symptoms of these problems, fluoride poisoning, the sweating and the confusion. It's a complete blocking of the cholinergic system. And so he was quite anxious because publicly he didn't want chronic fluoride poisoning associated with the very well-known and very public acute toxicity problems of nerve gases. So, but then something happened in 1982 and 1983. There was a complete turnaround. It was quiet among the medical people, but Sternweiss and Gilman linked the aluminum and beryllium fluoride complexes to cell receptors. Now, Hodge had to have known this because in one of his publications, he actually stated that cyclic AMP production by low levels of fluoride were actually increased. He said that fluoride was twice as potent as glucagon, the hormone glucagon. He also said that fluoride was more active than adrenocorticotropic hormone in fat cells. He said, this deserves thought. But he didn't say anything further, and it was in 1982 and 1983 that I became associated with him. And so with his mindset, he says the neurochemists are very interested in the fact that fluoride is more potent than some of our endogenous hormones. And so he said, well, that deserves thought. But did he say anything publicly? No. Did the American Medical Association between 1982 and 2000, they started, in fact, reversing. Remember, they were in the corner in the back and letting the dental community go out forward with it? Well, in 2000, they were all of a sudden urging physicians to correct the problem of people not getting enough fluoride. So they completely reversed their positions, and they said, go out and make the correction, make sure that the public is getting enough fluoride and that they're not getting exposed to suboptimal levels of fluoride. So here's the timeline. There's a very big reversal here, the American Medical Association. And there's Hodge in 82 and 83 saying, neurochemists are interested in this hormone link. And what does this have, this deserves thought. Of course he was thinking about this because he knew in his work with the War Department and studying fluoride that if you combine fluoride with metallic salts and you compare the response in a dose-response curve of fluoride alone with fluoride and metallic salts, and this was in documents that were dated in 1945 or 1946, they knew that both the effects on the lung and the skin were enhanced if fluoride coexisted with metals like beryllium. And they, in fact, knew they had human evidence that the effects in the fluoride were greater than beryllium. And they knew that ammonium beryllium fluoride, their effects were greater than simple fluoride compounds. There was animal data. He also did animal studies showing that fluoride beryllium compounds enhanced pulmonary toxicity, and it did more than that. When you combine the metal with the fluoride, it caused a greater deposition of fluoride in teeth and bones compared to fluoride alone. So When Sternweiss and Gilman in '82 said that they linked aluminum and fluoride and beryllium and fluoride and linked it with cell receptors, he knew privately that yes, there is something going on between fluoride and hooking it with metals, and it completely changes the whole situation. So that the public image, though, that he came out with, they said that in vitro enzyme effects of fluoride were seen at millimolar concentration levels and that they were irrelevant to in vivo toxicity. That's what Hodge, he fostered that knowledge, he fostered that impression, but secretly he knew that you combine fluoride with metals and you're talking about a different dose-response curve altogether. So we've got an evolution of our understanding of fluoride toxicity mechanisms that we're going to have to go through. Our old ideas were really based on fluoride alone. They were based on interactions of ions, in particular, like it binding calcium, competing with iodine, breaking hydrogen bonds, binding with magnesium and manganese. And also in vitro studies was the predominant thing, and it was based on like a one cell type in vitro study. They didn't have the sensitivity a methodology did to in vivo type studies. Then it's amazing, this is completely different colors. Anyway, the new ideas, though, that is coming in, and we know now, if you take millimolar levels of fluoride and just add micromolar amounts of aluminum, forming aluminum fluoride complexes, or if you take millimolar amounts of fluoride and just a micromolar amount of beryllium, you get an impact on a system at dose levels that were much lower than any of them ever anticipated. Plus, we got the in vivo studies, where we can look at homeostatic controls of function. So we've gone through an evolution. Our old notions of simple fluoride alone and ion reactions have gone by the wayside. The experiment that Sternweiss and Gilman did, and the way that they actually found that fluoride and aluminum and whatever, they were doing some in vitro enzyme studies, and they actually did studies, and they used distilled water in one experiment, and they used fluoridated tap water in the other. And they were getting reactions where the fluoride actually caused the aluminum to leach out of the glass, and all of a sudden it was affecting phosphoryl transfer enzymes that were quite important to cell signal transduction and energy metabolism. So all they had to do was throw in a little bit of aluminum, and they were getting reactions that they hadn't seen before. And now we go in completely a different direction. And we have to learn, if you want to learn about fluoride and how it impacts the body, you have to look at it as a receptor malfunction disease. So I want to introduce the concept of receptors. The definition of any receptor is that it's any cellular macromolecule to which a drug binds to initiate its effects. Well, fluoride is a drug, and fluoride will interact with these macromolecules, or the receptors. The functions of these receptors: there's a ligand binding portion that can combine with hormones or growth factors or neurotransmitters or whatever. And then the other portion is there's a message propagation. That's the regulatory cell signaling that takes the message from the receptor on the cell membrane or whatever and takes the message into the cell, into the cytoplasm, and directs its activities. It makes the cell become a cell. Fluoride affects both the ligand binding and the message propagation functions. In terms of structure, fluoride also can affect the ligand binding domain and the effector domain. But let's go into deeper here and understand. I've shown you this before, I know, but I think it bears repeating. The receptor mechanisms, you have to understand the general groups of what types of receptors are. There is the first, number one there's an enzyme receptor. Those are this structure here. That's the receptor where an actual enzyme is sitting on the plasma membrane. Here's inside of a cell. This is a cytoplasm. And this is the type of receptor. It's just called an enzyme receptor. And that is the receptor for the cell to respond to insulin or epidermal growth factor or insulin-like growth factors. The second receptor type is the ligand-gated or ion channel receptors. That particular receptor subtype responds to it's the nicotinic cholinergics, glutamate, GABA, glycine, serotonin. All of these neurotransmitters that you would recognize basically work through this type of receptor cell type. Next one, this one here called the transcription receptor. That's the type which directs gene transcription. That's the receptor cell type for thyroid hormones, steroid hormones, vitamin D, and retinoids. But you see, I've left a great big receptor right here. And even though I am talking about all of these receptors, it's the G protein coupled receptor that we're going to focus on, because that's one of the most important stories linked to fluoride, is around this third type, or G protein coupled receptor. The important overall information to know is that fluoride can impact each and every one of these receptor cell types. They may do it directly, it may do it indirectly via crosstalk and the internal to the cell in terms of sharing signaling systems, but either directly or indirectly, fluoride has consequences for each and every one. But let's focus specifically on the G protein, and I've abbreviated here as G protein coupled receptors, GPCRs. A cell may express as many as 20 different G protein coupled receptors. Half of today's prescription non-antibiotic drugs are directed towards these G protein coupled receptors. Half of all of our drugs on the market today are directed to those types of receptors. Fluoride impacts mainly these GPCRs. And fluoride became a pharmacologist tool to study receptors and actually develop the ways to target drugs to those receptors. So, you got fluoride directed towards GPCRs, and you've got half of the drugs out there on the market that's going towards these types of receptors. The GPCRs activate several cell signal transduction systems via direct and indirect pathways, as I mentioned. The GPCR activation can impact other classes of receptors, that enzyme receptor, the ion-gated receptor, the transcription receptor, because there's crosstalk, and the GPCR can stimulate and affect the response to enzyme receptors and ion channels in the transcription receptors. Now let's slow down and go and look at that G protein coupled receptor. Here's the cell membrane, here's the cell cytoplasm. And by the way, I don't know if any of you ever read Goodman and Gilman's Pharmacological Basis of Therapeutics. How many of you have you read one of that book in the last 10 years? 2. That's completely different. I mean, when I first went into pharmacology back in the 1970s and was reading that, you read the latest version of the Pharmacological Basis of Therapeutics and how it describes fluoride, in it, they basically haven't changed. They've totally left out the whole point that we wouldn't have any of this information on G protein-coupled receptors had it not been for fluoride. Had it not been for fluoride combined with aluminum. So let's look at the anatomy of a G protein-coupled receptors. You've got the receptor portion. That's this little curlicue 7-alpha helical structure here that keeps crossing the membrane. You have the ligand binding in and ligand binding here. What I mean by that is it could be norepinephrine, epinephrine, dopamine, or prostaglandins. This is the ligand binding, and then the other end is connected in association with the transducer portion of the G protein-coupled receptor. That consists of 3 subunits, beta, gamma, and alpha. Alpha is combined with GDP. GDP is, all that means is it's guanine, it contains guanine and diphosphate. That situation there, then the transducer is connected to the effector portion of this receptor. Now, this alpha GDP, there's a lot of different types of alpha GDP. In that stage, with alpha connected with the beta and gamma portions, that is the inactive stage. But let's talk about that, how we go and what happens and how this whole thing actually generates a signal. First of all, let's start back over with the receptor, the ligand and binding portion. What happens is that norepinephrine, dopamine, or whatever comes in, binds the receptor. Next thing, that causes the beta-gamma portions or subunits to disassociate from the alpha that is connected with the GDP. And when that disconnects, it goes from the inactive stage, and then it goes over to, it becomes the alpha GTP, it's converted, and this is the active form. And that turns on the effectors. Now, what are the effectors over there? The effectors are enzymes like adenyl cyclase, phospholipase C, I think we've heard a mention of those before, phosphodiesterases, the calcium and potassium ion channels. Now, that we then go from the active, what happens then is it stimulates the alpha GTP hooked with the GTP, forms the active state, causes those effectors to start cranking out secondary intracellular messengers, like cyclic AMP. So those effectors will actually start producing cyclic AMP. Then what happens, the next step is GTPase. That's the enzyme that takes the GTP back to GDP. And when that enzyme is functioning properly, it will take that from the active state and push it back to alpha hooked with GDP, and it is no longer active, it is inactive, and it will not be creating any more secondary messengers such as cyclic AMP. Now, I mentioned the effectors, and I mentioned this alpha GTP. It's important that you realize that there's all different kinds of and I'm going to abbreviate them as GS, GTP, and what does that do to the effector? What does it affect? In particular, that increases the activity of adenyl cyclases, and it increases the calcium currents. What that means is it increases the level of cyclic AMP. That is a GS subunit. There's another G protein, it's called GI. What does it do? It causes adenyl cyclase to decrease, the potassium currents to increase, and basically what it'll do is it will decrease cyclic AMP levels. You see what's developing here? These receptors have a very intricate system of controlling levels of these secondary messengers on the inside of the cells. Another important alpha subtype is GQ. What happens to it? It stimulates, increases phospholipase CB, calcium release, and that is important like in neurotransmitter release. So you want to look at GS, GI, GQ. Is that all of the alpha subtypes? No. To date, there are like 16 different alpha subunits. There are 5 different beta subunits, and there are 11 different gamma subunits that have been identified so far. And different cells will have different amounts of these 3 different types of alpha subunits. Now, what is the impact of these cytoplasmic second messengers like cyclic AMP? Well, it's because of the cyclic AMP levels that directs the PKA, or phosphorylates, the metabolic enzymes and transport proteins, transcription factors for gene expression. The ion channels, it controls cellular control of membrane potential and intracellular control of calcium. Phosphodiesterases, it can actually control the level of cyclic AMP. The amount of cyclic AMP is going to determine their activity. And it's these phosphodiesterases which break up and destroy or change the cyclic AMP that are the targets of drugs for asthma, COPD, heart failure, atherosclerosis, neurological disease, and erectile dysfunction. So cyclic AMP levels inside the cell, these second messengers, are extremely important in the pharmacological world. You change the second messenger like calcium. Of course, we know that controls metabolic enzymes, the protein kinases, the calcium binding proteins. They regulate exocytosis of neurotransmitters and actual muscle contraction. Now, I've just gone through the normal process of how you would stimulate a G protein-coupled receptor if it's behaving normally. But what do we know? What happens when fluoride gets into the mix? Here's the kind of the diagrammatic structure of a regular phosphate group. The problem is the phosphate group, in that, remember that GTP and GDP that determines whether it's active or inactive? Well, this is the structure. You have a GMP and the phosphate groups, and they've actually shown the crystalline structure of it. And what happens is the GTP, of course, via GTPase, converts it to GDP to make it active or inactive. So those GTPase enzymes are extremely important. What happens with fluoride, though, when it combines with aluminum, it becomes a phosphate mimic. It looks like this. Notice the similarity in the structures. What happens then, though, is it forms, instead of the GTP, you've got the guanine monophosphate plus a phosphate group, and then that aluminum fluoride fits in that whole portion, and it forms a GDP with aluminum tetrafluoride on. There's the crystalline structure of it that's actually been visualized. And you can compare the difference. What happens is that this structure and that aluminum inhibits GTPase enzyme. Now, medically, we know how important that is. But before we talk about that GTPase inhibition, let's go through this again, this whole process. We'll start over here with this receptor. The ligand is coming in this time, binds with the ligand portion of the receptor, and then, of course, the next stage is it causes the beta-gamma portion of the G protein to uncouple from the alpha subunit, and it goes from the inactive stage. But then fluorine comes in. And when it's converting over, what happens then is, instead of forming that alpha GTP, the active portion, it forms the alpha GDP dot aluminum tetrafluoride. So, as I just showed you, that inhibits GTPase. So GTPase is inhibited. Then what happens? It locks it in the active position. So what happens? When it stimulates the effector, it starts cranking out cyclic AMP, and cyclic AMP, and cyclic AMP. So you're increasing the whole cyclic AMP, that important secondary cell signaling message, just by changing the amount of cyclic AMP. And Harold Hodge knew this. And he knew that fluoride was more potent than glucagon and these other hormones at turning out or increasing cyclic AMP. So it's interfering with the whole cell signaling process. I showed you aluminum tetrafluoride, but in reality, that didn't come out. The aluminum trifluoride actually can work in another enzyme and impact the RAS, a smaller G protein, that's a portion of the cell signaling system of another enzyme. So it's not just linked to G protein. Now, medically, the GTPase regulated processes, here's what they regulate, and here's what you don't want to interrupt, like fluoride does. It's involved with phagocytosis, cell cycle progression, which is absolutely critical in brain development, cell adhesion, gene expression, and apoptosis. And you can find all of that in Goodman and Gilman's The Pharmacological Basis of Therapeutics. What Goodman and Gilman does not tell you, though, is that they learned all of this by using fluoride aluminum complexes. But they did learn an awful lot about cell signaling. Now, there's one more thing you're going to have to learn about this whole, is that they're homeostatic controls. There's feedback inhibition of signaling. When that ligand comes and binds with that receptor, it signals these G protein-coupled receptor kinases, called GERCs for short. And there are some that are called arrestins and so forth. Basically what that does is, that's just the little doorbell that says, okay, you have stimulated that receptor one time. And by doing that, it starts these cells saying, I've been stimulated once, I don't want to be stimulated again. And what happens is then, those can actually, with an increased receptor stimulation, that can create situations of desensitization. What happens is that receptor then can be chewed up, and it will disappear. If that receptor hasn't been impacted and the receptor stimulation decreases, as a matter of fact, that causes hypersensitization, and in fact, more receptors will actually appear, and instead of having, X number, you may have 2X or 3X of these receptors starting to appear on the cell surface. Now, Goodman and Gilman knows a lot of what happens if those homeostatic controls over these receptors go haywire. Those are the receptors, the deficiencies, like receptor deficiencies. The diseases are testicular feminization syndrome, myasthenia gravis, that's when the nicotinic cholinergic receptors are, the homeostatic controls are abnormal, the insulin-resistant diabetes, the insulin receptors, and a generalized endocrinopathy like pseudo-hypoparathyroidism. Those are actual, honest-to-God diseases that are recognized as being only a genetic cause, that they know that there's receptor deficiencies, and they've seen this. There are other things that happen, aberrant receptors. It can impact cellular proliferation, and it can involve cancer. Anytime you overstimulate the G protein-coupled receptors, you can impact and create cancer. Stimulation of the insulin, the epidermal growth factor, retinitis pigmentosa, precocious puberty, malignant hypertension. All of these are related to GPCR aberrant receptors. Altered responses to drug therapy or its continuing efficacy, to the point that all of these phrases here are involved. Desensitization, supersensitivity, tolerance, and withdrawal are involved with the receptor or unusual receptor mechanisms. Now, up to this point, all I've talked about is one cell at a time. What fluoride does, how it interrupts it. But that does not give you the idea of how toxic this stuff can be. And the only way to realize that is to go to multiple systems, various cells that are combined in axes. And in other words, you've got to start realizing how G protein-coupled receptors, for example, and all of the receptors are involved in what makes a cell a cell. Here's the thyroid function. The thyroid has been described in the textbook in Goodman and Gilman, where we thought that fluoride used to impact. We thought that it impacted the iodine uptake. We thought that it impacted the thyroid peroxidase enzyme involved with hydrogen peroxide to oxidize iodide ion and to form the diiodotyrosine and mono, and to form the di and mono iodotyrosine and the T3, T4 enzymes. And they have shown where fluoride in the past affected the reabsorption of the thyroglobulin, and basically it could impact the T3, T4 levels. That's what they thought fluoride did some time ago. But they didn't look at it as a receptor malfunction disease, and now what we're trying to do is to go back and map what type of G protein-coupled receptors, what type of receptors are involved in this whole process. When you do that, you realize that you start out from the hypothalamus, you get the thyroid-releasing hormones, you get those receptors that are involved with the hypothalamus sending messages down to the anterior pituitary to put out the thyroid-stimulating hormone. All of that works through G protein-coupled receptors, the GS, GQ. It involves, on the thyroid cell, there are both GS and GQ coupled receptors. There's both of these because they found that GQ actually is involved in the hydrogen peroxide formation, which is important to make iodine to the oxidation state necessary to form the T3 and T4. And GS is increases. It's like there are two types of receptors there, so you're getting dual function with different types of receptors. So in terms of, and the TR that you see here, those are transcription receptors. Indirectly, fluoride, by hitting the G proteins, the hypothalamus, the anterior pituitary, and on the thyroid, can impact the levels of the thyroid hormones, and in turn, which will impact the transcription receptors that are sitting out there in the various cells, waiting for the messages from the thyroid hormone. Now, fluoride, we know it hits this. So instead of just hitting the iodine, the transport, we know that fluoride is hitting all of these G proteins, the transcription receptor, and up here at the transcription receptor. And so what do we see? We can see hypothyroidism, we can see hyperthyroidism. goiter, fatigue, and growth inhibition. And all of that can be because of selective hitting of G protein-coupled receptors. Now, I'm not going to take it, but I'm going to talk about the receptors in blood sugar and insulin control, because this is the same thing. The pancreatic beta cells have all of these G protein type receptors and that are responding to adrenergic, somatostatin, all of these hormones, glucagon, cholecystokinin, the adrenergic input. All of that is important for putting out the insulin levels, which hit the enzyme receptors, and all of that goes for metabolism and cell growth. It's impacting the cell signaling and, of course, transport of glucose. Now, if you look then at fluoride, of course, again, it's going to go through all of these G protein receptors, enzyme receptors, and so forth and so on, to the point that in fluoride-poisoned individual, we've seen both hyper and hypoglycemia. We've seen glucose intolerance, increase in diabetes, increase in atherosclerosis, immunoreactive insulin, and glucose. It decreases the glucose to insulin ratio, and we see cases of pancreatitis. Again, I'm just mapping out, I'm going through systems where fluoride is notorious for impacting these types of symptoms. Here's the receptors in water conservation. Look at all of these receptors, G protein-coupled receptors, in the production and release of vasopressin, impacting the posterior pituitary, impacting the anterior pituitary, and it, again, the connection of the posterior to the anterior pituitary is through a G protein. Vasopressin that talks to the kidney to cause water reuptake is going through a GS protein-coupled receptor. The vasopressin that works on the smooth muscle, the vascular smooth muscle, it's going through your GQ protein receptors. GQ, GS, GI, all of them are involved in vasoconstriction, the glycogenolysis, platelet aggregation, and acetylcholine, adrenocorticotropic hormone release. And again, fluoride is has the opportunity to hit at all of these such that you typically see diabetes insipidus, polydipsia, polyuria. A decrease in vasopressin has been found, and a decrease actually in the acetylcholine nicotinic receptors. And quickly, I just want to go the receptors in blood calcium levels and bone turnover. Look at all the G proteins. Is it any wonder that fluoride is going to impact bone? I mean, from the hypothalamus all the way to the anterior pituitary to the liver, and with growth hormone release to the insulin growth factors and the effects of causing chondrogenesis and skeletal growth, all of these are going through on bone to kidney and to calcitriol. All of these are going to have G protein-coupled receptors. And so the parathyroids that are sending out calcitonin and the whole circuit of the parathyroid hormone control, all of that to control calcium and phosphate levels in the body is all going through heavily through G protein-coupled receptors. Obviously, with fluoride and bone, the metabolic bone disease, it's connected now with rickets, osteosclerosis, osteoporosis, fracture, osteomalacia, increased parathyroid as in secondary hyperparathyroidism, increased calcitonin, and in fact, osteosarcoma. The osteosarcoma link is most likely through this impact on growth hormone, and the release of fluoride has been shown to impact levels of insulin-like growth factors. Now, so fluoride affects just the teeth? This is what the dentists have been saying for, and there's only one way to react to that. It's complete nonsense. For fluoride to affect the teeth, it's got to go through these hormonal receptor controls first. There is no way in God's green earth that you can focus fluoride on just the teeth. We have to look at chronic fluoride poisoning as completely as a receptor disease. You have to consider the dose-response curve. And the first thing you have to do, the dental community and the public health, I don't want to put just on the dental community, has to understand first the difference between concentration versus dose. The concentration is milligrams fluoride per liter of water. It could be parts per million, parts per trillion, parts per billion. But that just tells you nothing about dose or how much is taken into the body. That's based on milligrams per day or milligrams per kilogram per day. The thing is, just because you talk about and give a concentration, there is no control of the consumption. So you have no idea of what the dose is. So these inane comments out of CDC that 1 part per million in the drinking water will give about 2 milligrams fluoride ingested per day, and they say fluoridation delivers a small and controlled dose of fluoride. Hello? Before you can know what the dose is, you got to know how much somebody drinks. The fluoride dose delivered is safe, it's no toxicity, and effective at reducing cavities for all consumers. For all consumers. So you have no idea of the dose response. You, at this point in time, you have to rethink the dose response curve for chronic fluoride toxicity. You have to think of it in terms of G proteins and the hormones that are controlled basically through the various types of G proteins. At this low level, there is information that indicates, and that from what I found, that the GQ, basically you're talking about the thyroid releasing hormone, the thyroid stimulating hormone, the parathyroid hormone, vasopressin, and cholecystokinin all work through GQ. If that type of dose, what you see clinically is a specific endocrinopathy, and one of the first things that you'll see in all of these individuals that are going in this chronic fluoride toxicity is hyperlipidemia. I've had young men, in their 20s, start working with fluoride, and all of a sudden their cholesterol levels go from completely normal within a matter of, less than a year, and their cholesterol and triglycerides are off the charts. Their electrolyte levels, they can go up, they can go down, they fluctuate all over the map. But the one thing that's consistent is the electrolytes. You start seeing, temporary changes, and you start seeing some hormone levels changes. As you go up and you hit the GS receptors, which is the next step, those are the receptors, the thyroid stimulating hormone, calcitonin, the luteinizing hormone, secretin, parathyroid hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, corticotropic releasing hormone, growth hormone releasing hormone, glucagon, ACTH, cholecystokinin, ATP. Then when you screw up with those GS receptors, like I said, in the clinical, they know what happens when you see generalized endocrinopathy. The electrolytes are going off, the hormone levels are going off, and you'll see behavioral changes. Years ago, when I first published that fluoride impacted behavior, everybody pounced on me and said, how could fluoride be affecting behavior when it only affects the teeth? If you understand the fluoride mechanism and how it's affecting the G protein-coupled receptors, the only conclusion, how could it not impact behavior? You know what the hormone changes in those hormone levels will do to behavior. When it goes on up to GI, this is the clinical outcome, becomes death, shock, hypocalcemia, hyperkalemia, ventricular fibrillation, hemorrhagic pulmonary edema, and those somatostatin and ATP all work through the GI receptor. So you need to start thinking of the whole dose response in terms of G proteins and the hormones that work through those specific G proteins. The susceptible populations is important because this whole dose responds because you don't know where in that dose-response curve that those sensitive populations are. Individuals with the impaired kidneys, cardiovascular function, diabetes, individuals with compromised immune systems and osteoporosis, individuals with deficiencies of calcium, magnesium, or vitamin C, and the elderly and children. Those are the identified, those particular groups are going to reduce the dose that will be effective. Why are children so considered susceptible? Fluoride readily crosses the placenta, allowing an in utero exposure. There are developmental vulnerable periods where those G protein-coupled receptors, and all of those receptors are very important, in particular for brain development, and brain and bone development. Immature blood-brain barrier enhances penetration of the CNS. And children, especially less than 2 years, have poorly developed swallowing reflexes. And on a per body weight basis, children have 3 to 4 times greater fluoride exposure than do adults. Children less than 6 months old have skin 30% thinner. They should not be exposed. Here's one case study that in showing this whole thing. 1988, this young child was started giving sodium fluoride supplements, so 1 milligram per day. She was 2 3/4 years old. 1990, she started with the rashes, the lip sores, the flesh tone papules on the face. 1991, she had dry skin. It was thought to be probably contact dermatitis. Teacher reports of learning problems. 1993, the sodium fluoride was actually stopped, but she was too late. She already had dental fluorosis. 7 years later, she was well known to have menstrual irregularities, rashes, nausea, vomiting, fatigue. 2004, she had the nausea, vomiting continued. 2005, she was diagnosed with osteosarcoma. 2006, it metastasized to the lung. 2007, she died. All of that, and a lot of hormone changes in there, and it led to growth hormone. All of that is through fluoride and impacting. Here's another case report, a water treatment operator. What his problems? He got lesions all over the skin. His medical records, he had cardiac arrhythmias, T-wave inversion, fluctuating cardiac panels, anemia, pericarditis, clotting changes, and you can see the marks on his abdomen. He had gastrointestinal signs, he had the enzymes, the triglycerides, the glucose, everything was off, the liver function enzymes, the neurological problems. He had, his testosterone was down, he had chronic pains, paresthesias, arthralgias, myalgias, headaches, the whole thing. This is the picture of fluoride poisoning. In terms of his medical records, he had osteoarthritis, he had osteoporosis, adhesions, he had degenerative disc disease, he had bone spurs, he had TMJ problems, his teeth, he had, of course, dental caries, and, of course, fluoride at this point is completely the opposite, and his teeth were basically falling out. Oh, okay. I'm trying to go as fast as I can. The change in the effect levels over time. I'm going to go quickly through this because our whole knowledge of fluoride and the threshold effects, and I had to go through this for litigation purposes. What are the thresholds? The 1940s and 60s, they said it took 10 to 20 years at 20 to 80 milligrams a day to cause the effects on bones. In the 1970s, that was modified down, and it became 10 to 20 years at 10 to 25 milligrams a day. But today, we know it's 2 to 6 milligrams per day for life if you're normal, or 1.5 milligrams a day of fluoride if the patient has kidney problems, and in fact, you can get rickets in the children with just 5 months at those levels. Effects on the GI system. The threshold, these are the endpoints recognized, and the levels have basically stayed the same over time. The lowest level in sensitive individuals is 0.9 to 9.2 milligrams a day for fluoride. The clinical problems in the cardiovascular system, the arrhythmias, the atherosclerosis, hypertension, migraine, anemia, the dose levels have today stand at 1 milligram per day for migraine, 1.2 to 8.8 milligrams a day for EKG changes, and changes and causing myocardial damage in children. The genitourinary system, the diabetes insipidus, nephritis, and so forth and so on. The 1930s to today, they thought that 7 to 32 milligrams a day in normal individuals would cause renal damage, but 2 milligrams per day in sensitive individuals is all it took for the sensitive. Reproductive, it's 5 to 6 milligrams per day would be effective in normal individuals and 2 milligrams a day in children. I did not have that blue. It somehow or another got transported. Brain and behavior, all of these are the clinical endpoints that have been recognized, and today it stands at 1.8 part per million fluoride in drinking water, or 0.064 milligrams fluoride per liter in serum as causing effects on brain and behavior. Here's the important one that's really the change in effect levels in the respiratory system, and this is what set us on our ear and really put us in another direction. All of these are the clinical endpoints, effects on the respiratory system, until from the 1940s, back when Harold Hodge, to today, they said that the threshold for effects was greater than 3 parts per million or 2.5 milligrams fluoride per meter cubed. 2005 to today, though, that has been pushed down to 0.4 to 1 milligrams fluoride per meter cubed to inhale, and you're going to cause increases in interleukin-6 and tumor necrosis factor alpha. And those studies, what important is that? Those are the cytokines that recruit neutrophils to injury sites. They promote chronic inflammation, fibrosis, and cancer. This is what has driven, that impact on the respiratory system has driven the change of threshold limit values for fluoride in the workplace. 46 for fluorides, again, it was the 2.5 milligrams fluoride per meter cubed, but for hydrogen fluoride, it is now stands at 0.5 parts per million as fluoride, and that's based on the new government. And here's what's important. This is that from inhaling fluoride for 1 hour increases the tumor necrosis factor alpha. That impacts, those are one of the triggers to the hypothalamus, the anterior pituitary, and that's what triggers the whole hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, or the stress response. In other words, fluoride, by inhaling fluoride and stimulating these cytokines that in turn hit that whole axis, it causes the standard signs of steroid overdose. And if you look at this, and you can get this in the Goodman and Gilman, those signs fit chronic fluoride poisoning to a T. From the fluid and electrolyte imbalance, hypertension, hyperglycemia, increased susceptibility to infection, osteoporosis, behavioral effects, cataracts, the whole 9 yards. And of course, today, the diagnosis and treatment of chronic fluoride poisoning has produced, actually, a clash of the industries. The fluoridation industry and the pharmaceutical industry. They both have got their heads in the sand when it comes to fluoride. Why is the fluoridation perspective got this ostrich approach? Because they think that the total fluoride intake is just 2 milligrams a day from water fluoridation only. They look at it as one piece of the pie. The NRC 2006 has estimated that our daily intake is based on our toothpaste, food, pesticides, and air is between 0.8 and 11.5 milligrams daily, way over the level that's going to cause the impact. They don't realize that pesticides, water fluoridation, pharmaceuticals, workplace, all of these are giving us fluoride exposures. The total fluoride intake is still unknown. We inhale it, we consume it, and we drink it in water. The skin absorbs it, our bodies store it, and it hangs around for 20 years. We excrete it in the urine, the feces, and the sweat. And in fact, since I've tracked it in the Poison Control Center data from 1989 to 2005, the exposures to fluoride for children have been increasing all the way up, and of those exposures, we've been regularly causing adverse medical outcomes in a little over 3,000 children every single year. And yet, the fluoridation perspective, they keep putting out the same old propaganda. Fluoride is naturally occurring, it's nutrient, it's essential to the teeth, benefits all, it's safe and effective, and one of the great public health achievements of the 20th century. And they've even said that the chemical additives used in fluoridation delivers fluoride where we don't have to worry about the contaminants. And with those three chemicals, hydrofluorosilicic acid, sodium fluoride, or sodium fluorosilicate. The problem is we get those chemicals from places like Mexico. That's where our hydrofluorosilicic acid is coming. And we've actually analyzed some samples of that hydrofluorosilicic acid. Here's the metals that we found, and here's the levels. Aluminum, these are all in parts per million. This was done by a certified analysis laboratory in New Jersey. Look at the arsenic levels that we're putting in just by putting hydrofluorosilicic acid into the water. There's arsenic and barium and cadmium and manganese, and in this particular sample there was lead. So, you know, fluoride is not this perfect substance that's clean, that's being put into the water. And here are the salts. The salts come in, there's not a single salt fluoride chemical that's produced in the United States. We get all of it from China. And you know what China is like in terms of contaminants and the products that's been sent into this country. We analyze these systems and look at the amount of aluminum. 3,000 to almost 4,000 parts per million of aluminum that's in those salts that they're fluoridating some water. In the salts, we didn't have much arsenic, but we did kind of increase in, we didn't have much lead, but we had some more barium. We had, the biggest problem was that the amount of aluminum, the very thing that fluoride likes to combine with and cause an effect. In other words, whether it's hydrofluorosilicic acid or the salts, fluoride additives are like a box of chocolates. You never know exactly what you're going to get. You're going to get arsenic, you're going to get aluminum, you're going to get barium, you're going to get iodide, you're going to get chromium, you're going to get a whole lot of aluminum. Oops. The pharmaceutical perspective, I swear I'm getting to the end.
Yeah, we are time restrained. We have a speaker's forum, and we have to be out of here by 1:45 in about 20 minutes. So.
Oh, okay.
You bet.
The pharmaceutical perspective isn't much better. All they've done for years, they've stuck their head in the sand from a different perspective. They said ditto the fluoridation perspective. So all the problems that the fluoridation had their heads in the sand is the same true for the pharmaceutical companies. They have no clue as to the treatment for chronic fluoride poisoning, and yet they've used metal fluoride complexes for decades to explain receptor function. So receptor function is the basis of today's drug development. It's a win-win situation. Let the dentist put the fluoride into the drinking water. We're going to make the drugs that are going to take care of the symptoms caused by the fluoride in the drinking water in the first place. Because their whole strategy for drug development over the years has been focused on, and in fact, they've got a whole scheme of evolution of the drug design. They've been making, using fluorinated drugs. They've taken fluorine atoms, they were introduced to the drug structure to replace hydrogen or chlorine to increase potency. At one time, fluorinated drugs were saved for the most ill, but now they are widely used. Fluorinated drugs include antiviral agents, steroids, general anesthetics, antipsychotics, antilipemics, anti-inflammatory agents, antidepressants, yada, yada, yada. Fluorinated drugs help in understanding physiological and toxicological processes. Inserting fluorine changes the rate and route of drug metabolism to extend the duration of action, or in some cases, to alter the toxicity. Fluorinated drugs allow non-invasive monitoring of in vivo tissue pharmacokinetics. They use radioactive labeled fluorine in MRIs and spectroscopy. And so this whole use of fluorinated compounds is big pharmaceutical business. But it's not all good by having your head in the sand with this and following along, because look at the fluorinated pharmaceuticals that have been removed from the market because they didn't pay attention that fluoride and a lot of the pharmaceuticals are attracted or targeting the same endpoint, G protein-coupled receptors. Those are the list of the drugs that have actually gotten them into trouble. But there's one other issue that's gotten the pharmaceutical companies now in trouble. They've actually found that we have drugged waters. We have potent fluorinated drugs, we have non-fluorinated drugs, and we have fluoride from water fluoridation showing up in our water. As a matter of fact, drugs as contaminants, pharmaceuticals are found in surface, ground, and drinking waters. They're found in human waste and the incorrect disposal of unused drugs, most recently from the wastewater of drug production. As a matter of fact, the drug found at the highest level at 14 milligrams per liter in our water is ciprofloxacin, a fluorinated antibiotic with this type of chemical structure. So you've got reactions in drugged waters. Humans can defluorinate a drug. It can create and contribute to fluoride ion concentrations. We know this from the biotransformation of methoxyfluorine, and we can defluorinate them spontaneously. We've got compounds, we know that. So you've got urine fluoride plus fluoride from fluoridation, and there could be an additive reaction. We don't know how much the drugs are contributing to fluoride. We don't know how much the fluoride is fluoridation. And if you look at it in perspective, the fluoride that's coming from our drugs is a lot lower than the fluoride that's coming from fluoridation. But it doesn't even have to go through that mechanism of contributing the fluoride ion. You could have the urine drugs targeting the G protein-coupled receptors. It may not contribute any fluoride. As long as it's targeting G protein-coupled receptors, it can enter into a synergistic reaction with the fluoride from fluoridation. So the situation demands that we got to get our ducks in a row. You've got the pharmaceutical industry on one hand, and they're contributing parts per trillion, parts per million levels of all of these drugs in our drinking water. But they can say that the benefit is life-saving to have these drugs. So you can't take the drugs away. It's portrayed as risky drugged waters, though. And so there's going to be a liability question that the pharmaceutical companies are going to have to answer to. But they're going to turn around and they're going to point a finger at those who push fluoridation, because these levels of these drugs are in the part per trillion to part per million range at the most, whereas fluoride, the drug that was intentionally added by the dental community, was, they said, and it was just to benefit the teeth, and it was supposed to be safe and effective, and the liability was pushed to the states. So the problem is, you got this clash of the industries. Oops.
Be sure you get to the how you get it out of it. The detox part.
The point of the matter is, fluoride is a glucocorticoid excess. It stimulates the adrenal cortical. It's a typical hormonal disruption. And you have to treat it as a general endocrinopathy. And the pharmacology books are full of that. It's just that they don't tell you that this type of endocrine pathology is the same as fluoride poison. Whereas they say it's genetic, they're not recognizing that there's a biochemical trigger and it's the same thing. So consider the 2007 Darwin Award winner, The Alchemist. He tried to create an elixir of immortality. He daily swallowed small portion of poisons to strengthen his body and is to protect him from death. But of course he died for the sake of science. Considering fluoridation, all you should think of is remember The Alchemist. As you add fluoride with toxic contaminants daily to the drinking water. Water that is also contaminated with potent pharmaceuticals, and it's designed to hit the same receptors that are susceptible to fluoride. That is the qualifications to win you a Darwin Award, a disastrous scream scheme that is astoundingly idiotic. You had your 25-year reunion, and you talked about standing on the shoulders of giants. Well, here's what happened to me when I stood between the shoulders of giants. Harold Hodge on one side, who, of course, started the fluoridation, Jack Hine on the other, who was responsible for putting fluoride in toothpaste in the first place. This is what gave me and made me today. I'm educated, I'm experienced, and I'm jobless. I learned that the Harvard motto is Veritas, which is Latin for truth, and that's the Harvard way of, making me realize that the truth shall set you free. That's the Harvard way of saying you're fired. At Harvard, the workplace safety, they said, oh, well, we can offer you workplace safety. This is their idea of workplace safety. Like the guy who had to actually hold up the target at a military shooting. And what has it got me? When I go in and talk about fluoride, I'm known as the X-File lady, and that's the way I'm introduced. So this is one X-File lady saying goodnight.